The first note from Adrian's mother's piano silenced 40 dinner guests, but the thing that frightened me was not Adrian's reaction. It was the handwriting inside the bench. I was crossing the music room with champagne when a young donor pressed one key of the black Steinway beside the windows, apparently unaware that nobody in the Moretti house had played it for 15 years. Adrian crossed the carpet without raising his voice, and the young man backed away before Adrian finished saying, "Please don't touch that piano again." Everyone nearby suddenly became interested in drinks, paintings, anything except the instrument that had belonged to Marianne, Adrian's mother, before her death ended both her career and the music in that room. I knew the household rule because I had dusted around the Steinway for 3 years without ever lifting its fallboard, although I had once spent most of my life measuring days in scales, rehearsals, and competitions. What I did not know was why a penciled correction inside Marianne's Chopin score used the same crooked capital B my father had written on every birthday card he ever gave me. I was 31, employed as household staff, and practiced at being forgettable because invisibility paid on time and rarely asked dangerous questions. My father, Thomas, had been an accompanist and teacher in Boston before cancer brought me home from conservatory, where I had completed less than 2 years before medical bills turned music into something we could no longer afford. After he died, I sold my upright piano, took temporary jobs that became permanent habits, and eventually accepted a position with the Morettis because it offered health insurance, predictable hours, and very little interest in who I had once expected to become. Marianne had died 6 years before Thomas, so I had no reason to connect their lives, and he had never mentioned her name around me. That should have made the handwriting easy to dismiss, except Thomas formed his capital B with an open lower loop because an old hand injury kept him from closing the stroke cleanly. I had watched him write it thousands of times, and the mark on Marianne's score carried the same flaw. The score landed at my feet because the pianist hired for dinner had been stranded north of the city by heavy snow, leaving Julian Cross, a conductor advising the Moretti Arts Foundation, to joke that wealthy donors might finally be forced to entertain one another. While collecting abandoned glasses near the Steinway, I noticed an incorrect breathing mark beside a phrase in Chopin's C-sharp minor nocturne, and muscle memory overruled employment wisdom before I could stop myself. I erased the mark lightly and moved it to the place Thomas had taught me to hold the phrase, believing nobody had seen until Julian spoke from behind my shoulder. He asked why a maid was correcting Chopin, although his tone carried curiosity rather than ridicule, and I made the mistake of answering that the line did not make musical sense where it had been marked. By then, Adrian had turned from the fireplace. Evelyn had stopped speaking to a donor, and the room that paid me to disappear had decided I was worth watching. Julian asked whether I played, and I admitted that I used to, hoping the past tense would discourage every question that followed. Adrian came closer but stopped several feet from me, his attention fixed on the score instead of the embarrassment spreading across my face. "Do you know the piece?" he asked, and when I said yes, he asked whether I would play it, apparently forgetting for a moment that the instrument had been forbidden to everyone else. I looked at the guests, the piano, and the man who signed the payroll checks, then told him no because correcting a phrase did not mean I wanted to perform at somebody else's dinner. Julian's eyebrows rose, Evelyn's expression tightened, yet Adrian simply nodded and told the room, "She said no, so leave it there." The conversation restarted awkwardly, and I carried my tray into the service corridor before anyone could see that my hands had begun shaking for reasons unrelated to Adrian. 10 minutes later, he found me beside the prep counter, apologized for putting me on display, and promised nobody would ask me to play again. Then he placed Marianne's score on the metal surface between us and asked, "Before you go back in there, tell me why you kept staring at this handwriting." I considered lying because Thomas had been dead long enough that protecting his privacy had become indistinguishable from protecting my own. But Adrian had already noticed too much for an easy answer. I explained the damaged B, the forward slanting T, and the habit Thomas had of pressing harder on the final stroke whenever he wrote quickly, all three of which appeared in annotations scattered across Marianne's score. Adrian studied the page without touching it, then asked my father's full name, correcting himself halfway through, as though he had realized how much his questions sounded like instructions. When I said Thomas Bennett, something changed in his face. Not recognition exactly, but the frustration of a memory refusing to arrive when summoned. He told me the name seemed familiar, and asked whether Thomas had ever spoken about Marianne, which he had not. Not once during all the years music had filled our apartment. Adrian looked toward the music room, where guests were laughing again, around a piano nobody touched, then said something that made the handwriting impossible to dismiss. My mother stopped letting people mark her personal scores long before she died, Claire, so if your father wrote in that one, she must have trusted him enough to hand it over. The following afternoon, I sat at Marianne's piano because Adrian had left the music room unlocked and told nobody to watch me, which made the decision more difficult than any command would have been. I spent 10 minutes pretending to dust a cabinet before finally lowering myself onto the bench, where the polished keys looked almost accusatory beneath hands that had spent 15 years carrying trays, scrubbing stains, and avoiding anything that reminded me what they once did. My first scale sounded uneven, my left hand lagged, and the fourth finger on my right hand collapsed twice before I found enough control to continue. I opened the Chopin score, played slowly through the first page, then reached the disputed phrase and held the breath exactly where Thomas had taught me when I was 16. Someone moved near the doorway, and I stopped so abruptly the final note died before the pedal released. Adrian stood there without his jacket, looking less offended that I had touched the forbidden piano than unsettled by how I had played 4 measures of music. He apologized for startling me, then asked whether I could repeat the phrase before catching himself and saying I did not have to play another note. I asked why it mattered, and he explained that Marianne had held that particular pause longer than other pianists, never on her commercial recordings but consistently during rehearsals Adrian overheard as a teenager. Thomas had used nearly the same explanation with me, saying the return should feel reluctant, as though the music understood that moving forward meant leaving something behind. Adrian asked again whether Thomas had mentioned Marianne, and I told him famous names had never impressed my father enough to become family stories. He worked wherever musicians needed him, taught students in church basements and community schools, and occasionally disappeared for rehearsals he described only as a decent job with difficult people. Adrian almost smiled at that description, then admitted Marianne had kept rehearsal logs, correspondence, and private recordings in a downstairs archive he had barely opened since her funeral. We agreed to look together only after I insisted Evelyn be told, because one mystery inside a wealthy family was enough, without creating another through secrecy. The archive was not a magical room waiting to explain our lives. Most of it was boring, badly labeled, and frustratingly incomplete. Evelyn had organized boxes after Marianne's death, but Victor, Adrian's father, had moved material between the estate, foundation offices, and an old warehouse during the final years of Marianne's career, leaving several numbered gaps in the catalog. We found programs, tax receipts, recording invoices, and 3 cassettes bearing Marianne's name, yet the only tape mentioning Thomas had deteriorated so badly that 20 seconds of warped piano were followed by static. A notebook contained Marianne's rehearsal dates but used initials for accompanists, and TB appeared only twice, which proved possibility rather than a relationship worth building a theory around. Adrian was visibly disappointed, while I felt something closer to relief, because uncertainty allowed me to return Thomas to the uncomplicated place where I had stored him. Then Evelyn found an old concert program stamped with the address of St. Gabriel Community Arts Center, and beneath Marianne's printed biography someone had written, in Thomas's unmistakable hand, Tuesday, 7:30, no press. St. Gabriel still existed on the south side, although the arts program had moved buildings twice, and its records lived in donated filing cabinets inside a converted parish school. Adrian offered to send staff, and I told him I would go myself, because I was the one claiming Thomas's handwriting, while he could come if he left security outside and allowed the director to treat us like ordinary strangers, asking inconvenient questions. The director, Mrs. Alvarez, remembered neither Thomas nor Marianne personally, but she found a ledger showing that a M. Rossi had rented their small recital room 4 times over 8 months, always paying cash and always listing Thomas as musical director. Rossi had been Marianne's mother's maiden name, something Adrian confirmed only after we stepped outside, and his reaction told me Marianne had deliberately used it to keep those rehearsals away from Victor's management office. More disturbing was a photocopied reimbursement form showing Thomas received nearly $12,000 from a private account during that same period. I knew my father had struggled financially later, so the payment looked large enough to raise a question neither of us wanted to ask. On the drive back, Adrian refused to speculate, but I could feel my own mind doing it without permission. arranging facts into the ugliest available shape. Perhaps Thomas had been more than an accompanist. Perhaps Marianne had paid him to hide rehearsals. Perhaps he had taken money from a woman trapped in a marriage and then never mentioned her, because secrecy benefited him too. Adrian finally said the amount might cover venue rentals, musicians, transport, or several months of work, which was reasonable and did nothing to calm me. I asked whether Victor had known about St. Gabriel, and Adrian admitted he had no idea because his father died before Adrian inherited full control of Marianne's records. Back at the house, we searched the catalog for the private account referenced on the reimbursement form and discovered that every folder covering those 8 months was missing. Evelyn remembered Victor removing a banker's box after Marianne's funeral, but she had assumed it contained tax documents he considered personal. For the first time, the mystery had produced not an answer, but a deliberate absence. That night I lay awake, remembering Thomas correcting students for taking shortcuts, returning a grocery cashier's extra $20, and once driving 40 minutes because a restaurant had accidentally refunded our entire dinner instead of one bad entree. Those memories argued against the suspicion growing around the payment, but love makes unreliable evidence, and I hated myself for needing more than character to believe the man who raised me. The next morning, Julian arrived after Adrian asked whether professional archives sometimes preserved accompanist contracts through unions or publishers rather than estates. He found no contract, but he did find an application for an adult return-to-performance fellowship that had nothing to do with Marianne and everything to do with the way I had played. When I immediately said no, Julian told me he was not offering influence, only information, because the first round was judged anonymously and neither Adrian nor the Moretti Foundation had any role in selecting candidates. I took the application because refusing to look at it suddenly felt too much like accepting another missing file as the end of a story. 3 days later, the first real break came from a source none of us had expected to be useful, although it was not the kind of discovery that made anyone feel relieved. The music historian Adrian hired found Marianne's name in an old musicians' union dispute involving unpaid rehearsal expenses, where Thomas had filed paperwork on behalf of several freelance players working at St. Gabriel. According to the complaint, Victor's management company had refused reimbursement because the sessions had not been authorized, leaving Thomas temporarily responsible for venue costs and musician fees he had already guaranteed. The $12,000 from Marianne's private account therefore looked less like secret payment and more like repayment, but one handwritten note complicated even that explanation. Thomas had written, "Returned remainder to M after Boston plan canceled," suggesting there had been a second plan neither Adrian nor I knew anything about. The union file named no amount returned and gave no reason the Boston plan disappeared. We located the bank that had managed Marianne's private account, but privacy rules prevented access without documentation, proving Adrian's authority over her estate. And even then, several records had been destroyed under retention schedules years earlier. Adrian's lawyers began the process, while I increasingly disliked how quickly his resources could turn curiosity into an operation involving attorneys, archivists, and people who return calls because of his last name. When I said so, he asked whether he should stop, and I realized I had expected him to defend the machinery rather than offer me control over whether it continued. I told him to investigate Marianne's finances because they belonged to his family history, but anything involving Thomas had to come through me before becoming public or reaching the foundation. He agreed without bargaining, then asked whether I had submitted the fellowship application, and I told him I had filled it out but had not pressed send. "That sounds like a problem between you and the button," he said, which was irritating enough to make me laugh despite myself. That evening I practiced after staff dinner, struggling through scales on Marianne's Steinway until frustration made my shoulders lock and every note sound harder than the last. Adrian entered to retrieve a folder, heard enough to know I was losing patience, and wisely avoided offering musical advice he did not possess. Instead, he asked why I had stopped after Thomas died, and the full answer came out more sharply than I intended. Tuition had been due, medical debts survived the patient, my conservatory scholarship did not cover a leave longer than 1 year, and grief made auditions feel obscene when I was still sorting his clothes for donation. I had told myself I would return when life settled down, then found better reasons each year not to discover whether I still belonged among serious musicians. Adrian said he understood postponing something until postponement became identity, because he had done the same with Marianne's archive. I told him our situations were not equivalent, and he answered, "No, they aren't. But avoidance is not very original." I submitted the fellowship application before going to bed, partly because he was right, and partly because I resented that fact. The next setback arrived publicly, which made it worse than anything hidden inside a box. A guest from the winter dinner had mentioned the maid who corrected Marianne Moretti's Chopin to an arts blogger, and within 48 hours, a local site had published a speculative piece linking Thomas to Marianne's undocumented final rehearsals. The article implied Thomas might have possessed unreleased recordings, cited the $12,000 payment without context, and described me as a former conservatory student, now employed by the Moretti family, which transformed every private uncertainty into a story strangers could simplify. My phone filled with messages from people I had not heard from in years, including one former classmate asking whether Thomas had secretly managed Marianne. Julian received performance inquiries from me that I had never requested, and Evelyn received a collector's letter threatening legal action over rights to recordings nobody had even confirmed existed. Adrian wanted his attorneys to demand corrections immediately, but I asked him to wait until we knew what was actually false. Evelyn disagreed, and our argument in the morning room finally exposed the fear she had been disguising as administrative caution. She had watched reporters descend after Marianne's death, watched acquaintances sell anecdotes, and watched Victor respond by locking down every document until secrecy became family policy. Evelyn believed attention would consume me before I understood the rules, so she placed an envelope containing 6 months of salary and extended health coverage on the table and suggested I leave before my employment became part of the scandal. She called it an exit, not a dismissal, yet the condition was obvious. Take the money, disappear from the house, and let the family handle the story. I told her I would resign because continuing as Adrian's employee now complicated every decision I needed to make, but I would not accept payment tied to silence. When Adrian entered midway through the conversation, I handed Evelyn my folded apron and told him I was leaving at the end of the week, after transferring my responsibilities properly. Adrian looked from the envelope to me and asked whether Evelyn had ordered me out, but I refused to let the argument become another fight conducted by powerful people over my future. I explained that even if Evelyn had never made the offer, I needed to leave because Julian wanted me auditioning, strangers wanted me performing, Adrian needed answers about Marianne, and I could no longer tell which choices were mine while my housing stability and health insurance depended on his household. Adrian asked if increasing my severance or keeping coverage without conditions would help, then stopped himself when my face apparently answered before I did. He apologized, said my final reference would describe my work and nothing about music unless I requested otherwise, and promised he would not contact the fellowship. Evelyn removed the envelope from the table without defending it again, though the shame in her expression made anger harder to maintain. I left the room knowing I had just surrendered the safest job I had ever held before learning whether the life I wanted back would take me. My first week outside the Moretti house was humiliating in ways nobody writes into inspirational stories, beginning with the discovery that freedom did not pay rent or make my fingers stronger. I found temporary administrative work at a physical therapy office through a former coworker, practiced evenings on a digital keyboard with 3 sticky keys, and learned that 15 years away from serious playing could not be corrected by emotional breakthroughs. My scales were uneven, my wrists tired after 40 minutes, and the first recording I made for myself sounded so cautious that I deleted it before the final chord. Julian kept his promise not to coach me, sending only the audition requirements and confirmation that the panel would judge numbered audio files without names or employment history. Some nights I practiced 2 hours and heard progress. Other nights I shut the keyboard after 20 minutes and wondered whether returning to music was merely a more expensive form of nostalgia. For once, nobody stood nearby to tell me which interpretation was kinder. Adrian contacted me only once during that month, and the message concerned Thomas rather than us. The bank had recovered microfilm showing Marianne transferred money to St. Gabriel for rehearsal expenses, while Thomas returned $3,840 after a proposed Boston recital series was canceled before contracts were signed. More importantly, the account memo named an organization called North Harbor Arts Trust, which had operated a scholarship fund for young musicians until dissolving years later. I recognized nothing about it, but the trust's archived board minutes were held at a university library and could be requested by any member of the public, which meant I did not need Adrian's lawyers or permission. The minutes showed Marianne had proposed sponsoring one conservatory student as part of the Boston series, describing the candidate only as the daughter of a collaborating musician. 2 weeks later, the board approved the proposal provisionally, but a subsequent page recorded that Marianne's management representative withdrew it before the student's name was formally entered. I stared at that sentence until the librarian asked whether I needed help with the copier, because the missing name was both obviously mine and not legally provable from the document. My first reaction was anger at Victor, followed almost immediately by anger at Thomas for never telling me there had been even a possibility of help. Then I found a letter in the trust's correspondence file from Thomas himself, thanking Marianne for considering his daughter, but stating that he understood. Circumstances have changed and the Boston plan cannot proceed. He had believed Marianne canceled it. Nothing in his letter suggested he knew Victor had intervened. That discovery did not restore the scholarship, return the years, or transform my life into the career I might have had, but it removed the ugliest suspicion I had carried since seeing the payment ledger. Thomas had not sold Marianne's secrets, hidden money, or quietly decided I was not worth supporting. He had simply been given the same incomplete story I had. The audition took place 4 days later, and I walked into the rehearsal hall, carrying more history than was useful to anyone trying to play Schumann. 12 candidates warmed up behind thin doors, ranging from a former church pianist returning after raising 4 children to a software engineer who had abandoned conservatory after an injury. My opening piece went well until a transition I had never fully trusted, where my left hand landed unevenly and panic rushed through me fast enough to make stopping feel reasonable. I kept going because there was no dramatic insight available, only the practical knowledge that professional musicians make mistakes and continue playing. During Chopin, I reached Thomas's familiar pause and almost exaggerated it because the phrase had accumulated too much meaning, then chose a simpler interpretation closer to what the music required that morning. I left convinced I had been competent rather than extraordinary, which disappointed the part of me still hoping a return should justify itself through immediate brilliance. 2 days later, the fellowship emailed to say I had advanced to the final round, and the news frightened me more than rejection would have, because success created another opportunity to fail where people could see it. I chose a Schumann work Thomas had never taught me for the second audition, because I needed one part of my musical life that did not arrive through inheritance. Halfway through, I missed an inner voice, recovered within the measure, and finished with enough control that the mistake belonged to the performance instead of swallowing it. The final decision came 3 days later, while I was standing in a grocery store comparing prices on frozen vegetables, where the program director called and offered me one of 6 funded places. I asked her to repeat herself, then accepted before I could manufacture a responsible reason to delay. Afterward, I stood beside the freezer doors crying quietly, while another shopper moved around me with the polite indifference of someone who had her own life to manage. That evening, Evelyn called for the first time since my resignation and asked whether I was willing to hear an apology before any family news. She said fear had made her behave like Victor in the very moment she believed she was protecting me from what Victor's choices had created, and she did not ask forgiveness when I told her I needed time. Then she explained that Adrian had transferred control of Marianne's archive to a committee consisting of an archivist, a music historian, an estate attorney, and 2 independent musicians, none of whom reported to him on publication decisions. He had also restored the Steinway and opened the music room twice a month for scholarship workshops, but the program carried neither my name nor a story about the maid who rediscovered music. Evelyn sent one photograph after we hung up, showing folding chairs, instrument cases, coffee cups, and the black Steinway standing open beneath the winter windows. Adrian was not visible anywhere in the picture, and I was grateful for that. 6 months later, I played my fellowship recital in a 100-seat hall where nobody had ever seen me carrying a tray, and that anonymity felt more valuable than applause. I wore a dark green dress I had bought with my own money, played Bach with discipline, Schumann with one rough edge I could live with, and saved Chopin for last, because avoiding it would have given the old mystery more power than resolving it had earned. When I reached the pause Thomas had taught both Marianne and me in different years, I held it only as long as the phrase needed, not long enough to announce that everyone should notice its history. The final note faded into the wood-paneled room, and applause rose slowly enough that I had time to realize I was not waiting for Thomas, Marianne, or anyone else to tell me whether the performance counted. During my second bow, I saw Adrian in the back row beside an elderly man struggling to fold his program. No reserved seat, no entourage, and no visible attempt to make his presence part of the event. He waited until the lobby had nearly emptied before approaching, which gave me time to speak with faculty, help another performer locate a missing scarf, and survive Julian's detailed criticism of my Bach tempo. Adrian congratulated me without using the words brave, inspiring, or comeback, all of which I had come to dislike when applied to adults simply doing difficult work. I asked about the archive, and he explained that the committee had approved educational release of several rehearsals Marianne had specifically labeled for teaching, while private conversations would remain sealed unless written permission suggested she intended otherwise. Thomas would receive formal credit wherever recordings documented his participation, and any royalties attributable to him would pass through his estate, rather than the Moretti Foundation deciding what charity best represented his memory. I appreciated the legal dullness of that arrangement more than I would have appreciated a grand gesture, because fairness often looked less cinematic once adults stopped using money to express feelings. Adrian seemed amused when I said so, but he did not disagree. The reporter who had published the first speculative article created one final problem by contacting me for comment after learning about the fellowship recital. She had obtained enough documents to know Thomas did legitimate work with Marianne and offered to publish a correction, but only if I agreed to an interview about the abandoned scholarship and my years as a Moretti employee. I declined the profile and asked her to correct the financial implication based solely on the union records she could verify, which she eventually did after Adrian's attorney provided documentation without threatening litigation. The piece was shorter, less dramatic, and probably read by fewer people than the original rumor, which felt unfair until I accepted that truth does not always receive equal billing. More importantly, Thomas's reputation no longer depended on me telling strangers intimate details of his illness, our debts, or why I abandoned conservatory. I had spent years believing visibility and honesty were the same thing. They were not. After the recital, Adrian and I walked 2 blocks to a coffee shop because he asked whether I had time, and I was not ready to turn the evening into anything more formal. He told me he had recently declined a publisher offering a large advance for a memoir about Marianne's final years, partly because the proposal treated her conflict with Victor as a dramatic secret rather than a period she had worked hard to survive. I asked whether he would ever write about her, and he said perhaps one day, but only after deciding what belonged to his memory and what belonged to hers. When I asked why he had come to the recital, he said I had sent him the public program link 6 weeks earlier, which I had forgotten doing after sending it to several people. That is a very careful answer, I told him, and he admitted he was trying not to turn interest into entitlement. For a man accustomed to having doors opened before he reached them, uncertainty looked unexpectedly human on him. Adrian asked whether I still worked for him, and when I said no, he laughed because the question was obviously ridiculous but apparently necessary to him. Then he asked whether I would have dinner with him sometime, not because Thomas knew Marianne, not because I had played her piano, and not because either of us had rescued the other from anything. I asked what reason remained after removing all the dramatic ones, and he said he liked talking to me even when the conversation left him less comfortable than when it began. He also said he had watched me leave a secure job rather than let his family define what my music meant, and the decision made him respect me long before he knew whether I would ever perform publicly. His answer was awkward in places and lacked the polished certainty people expected from him, which made me trust it more. I agreed to one dinner and reminded him that one dinner was not a contract, whereupon he said, "I've had enough contracts attached to music for one lifetime." One dinner became several across the next 5 months, slowly enough that neither attraction nor history could disguise the practical differences between our lives. Adrian learned that I disliked restaurants without menu prices, while I learned his long silences sometimes meant he was choosing words rather than withholding them, although I still made him clarify when necessary. He attended a student workshop where I coached a 62-year-old widower through a piece his wife had loved, and afterward, Adrian helped stack chairs instead of donating something nobody had requested. I attended an archive exhibition where he corrected a donor who called Thomas Marianne's accompanist, explaining that surviving rehearsal tapes documented genuine collaboration in several interpretations. The correction mattered because it neither inflated Thomas into a secret genius, nor reduced him to furniture beside a famous woman. By then, I had begun to understand that our relationship worked best whenever neither of us needed the other person's life to prove anything about our own. 1 year after resigning from the Moretti house, I returned through its front entrance carrying sheet music instead of champagne, and nobody handed me a uniform after taking my coat. The music room looked almost unchanged from a distance, yet folding chairs filled the space where donors once stood beneath chandeliers pretending not to notice staff. The first annual Return to Performance recital had attracted adults whose careers had been interrupted by caregiving, military service, illness, financial collapse, immigration, and several ordinary forms of bad timing nobody would ever turn into inspirational movies. Adrian's foundation supplied the room and funding, but an independent board selected participants, hired teachers, and controlled awards without giving the Moretti family access to applicant names. After lengthy discussion, the board named its small collaborative archive project for Marianne and Thomas, while the scholarship itself remained deliberately neutral, so recipients would not become supporting characters in somebody else's family story. I had argued for that distinction and was pleased nobody credited me publicly for winning it. Evelyn approached before the first performance and asked whether she could sit beside me, which would once have sounded like a request too simple to carry history. She told me she had spent months cataloging correspondence with the committee and had found herself repeatedly wanting to remove letters that made Victor look controlling, only to realize that protecting a dead brother from judgment would distort Marianne again. I asked whether she hated him now, and Evelyn said no, which was harder than the answer she probably expected herself to give. Victor had loved his family, frightened the people around him, supported Marianne's career, constrained it, paid bills, blocked choices, and believed control proved devotion. None of those facts canceled the others. Her answer reminded me of Thomas, whose goodness had not guaranteed perfect judgment, and of myself, whose difficult circumstances had influenced my silence without making every later year inevitable. We listened as the first pianist, a nurse in her 40s, missed 2 notes, recovered, and finished smiling. During intermission, Adrian carried extra chairs from the hallway because attendance had exceeded the number listed on the registration sheet. A year earlier, I might have turned the image into symbolism, but now it mostly looked like a tall man trying not to drop 6 chairs on an elderly donor. He had sold 2 businesses, Victor once treated as untouchable family assets, and redirected part of the proceeds toward legal ventures he actually wanted to manage. A decision that caused months of internal conflict and several ugly newspaper stories. When I once asked whether the changes were supposed to redeem the Moretti name, Adrian said he was trying to make decisions he could defend while alive, rather than arranging a favorable biography afterward. That was enough for me, because transformation had become more believable once he stopped narrating it as transformation. He still liked control, still became impatient when meetings wandered, and still occasionally solved problems nobody had asked him to solve. After the final student left, I sat at Marianne's Steinway while Adrian gathered programs from empty seats, and I asked whether he wanted to hear the Chopin Nocturne again. He came to the bench but waited until I shifted over before sitting, an ordinary courtesy that would have meant nothing if I had not known the man who once treated the entire instrument as territory. I played without thinking about the gala, the blog article, Victor's missing files, the Boston scholarship, or the years when touching a piano felt like reopening a debt I could never repay. At Thomas's pause, I let the phrase breathe naturally and continued, because the measure after a meaningful silence still has to be played. When I finished, Adrian remained quiet until I asked whether something was wrong, and he admitted he had spent years believing the piano was the last part of Marianne nobody could take from him. Hearing strangers play it had finally taught him that losing exclusive access was not the same as losing her again. I told him selling my old upright after Thomas died had carried the opposite meaning for me, because I treated the sale as proof that circumstances had permanently removed music from my life. Money had been real, grief had been real, and returning sooner might genuinely have been impossible. Yet at some point necessity ended, and fear quietly continued doing the same job. Admitting that had once sounded like blaming myself for survival, but the fellowship taught me a less dramatic distinction. Explanations can be true without becoming permanent instructions. Adrian said he still had mornings when opening Marianne's archive felt like betrayal, And I admitted I still had rehearsals where one mistake made me want to disappear before anyone heard the next measure. Neither confession required a solution, which was perhaps the strangest improvement between us. A year earlier, both of us would have tried to fix the other person before the sentence ended. Adrian reached for my hand only after I left it resting palm up between us, then asked whether I had decided about the teaching position the fellowship offered for the following year. I told him I had accepted part-time because performing full-time no longer interested me as much as I once assumed it should, and helping adults return to music felt unexpectedly specific to the person I had become. He asked whether I worried that Thomas would have wanted a larger career for me, and I said Thomas was no longer available to revise my life, which sounded harsher aloud than I intended. Then I explained that loving my father did not require spending adulthood completing the future he imagined when I was 17. Adrian nodded because he understood the danger of letting dead parents remain in charge simply because disagreeing with them had become impossible. Outside the windows, evening settled over the snow while staff in the dining room argued cheerfully about leftover dessert. Before we left, Adrian closed the Steinway and placed its key on the side table where the next morning students would know to find it. I remembered the young donor who had touched one note a year earlier and how an entire room had reacted as if he had crossed a sacred boundary, never imagining that the boundary itself would become the beginning of everything that changed. Nothing about the year had restored the scholarship Victor blocked, returned my lost conservatory years, repaired Marianne's marriage, or given Adrian another conversation with his mother. What changed was smaller and more useful. We stopped treating old losses as instructions for every decision that followed them. Adrian asked whether I wanted dinner. I told him only if the restaurant printed prices, and he rolled his eyes before promising to find somewhere offensively normal. We walked out together while the piano remained behind us, unlocked, imperfectly repaired, and ready for whoever came next.